Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this very private, slightly improvised session due to a room change, due to an emergency. Of course, we have also another one. Our planned moderator, Annelies, got the seasonal flu. Thankfully, she got replaced last minute by my dear colleague Francesco, who is the moderator of the show here this beautiful Friday morning. And my name is Michaela Mayrhofer. I am working for BBMRI-ERIC, the research infrastructure for biobanks and biomolecular resources. We are having here an illustrious group representing an initiative that has set on the journey to come up with a GDPR code of conduct for health research. And it's quite interesting process, and we are proud to present you where we are at the moment. And I'm now handing over to my colleague Francesco.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'll be very brief. I work with Michaela at BBMRI-ERIC. I'm the engagement officer. And up until a few months ago, I would have been one of the patient advocates interested in understanding how this code of conduct can actually facilitate health research in Europe. Back in the day of the GDPR, I was very, very worried that the new legislation would hamper key research as a patient advocate. Maybe that's not the case, and maybe that's actually going to be very fruitful piece of legislation, provided that the code actually will facilitate and create some clarify some of the aspects, and that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm very glad to introduce also our speakers. I'll introduce them individually when they take the floor. If you have any burning question, we'll take one or two right after the presentations, but we prefer to keep also a nicer, more interactive discussion at the very end. So note your questions down. Anyway, we're going to have time, and there's plenty of room to debate. Let me start with inviting the first speaker to take the floor. Evert, please. Evert-Ben is a legal consultant from the Netherlands, and one, of course, the key persons behind the code of conduct. And Evert is going to provide us the perspective from the healthcare professional, and of course from his own law firm.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Evert.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I'm also involved in the writing group. My background is supporting researchers, also sometimes patient organizations, by the way, with registries. That's Recital 157, which recognizes the importance of registries for disease of research, at least into diseases. I'm also involved in biobanks, especially the further use biobanks, which means biobanks which are not specifically collected for one sort of research project, but which actually, you can also say leftover, but somebody told me leftover is only after a meal, leftover tissue, which comes from an operation and then has been diagnosed. There is also always tissue left after that. Now, these are so-called further use biobanks. I've been very much involved in those as well. And then the special disease biobanks, which are based on broad consent in the Netherlands. These registries are based actually on our research exemption. We don't have a special legislation for registries, which we have several. We have the cancer registry, which is all very comprehensive, covering nearly all cancer patients. It's not based on special legislation, but it is based actually on the opt-out system which we have for research if certain conditions are met. And one of them is that someone must be able to opt out of this research. And I've been also involved actually in this opt-out. As you can see, I'm a little bit older, so that opt-out was in 1995 embedded in the law, and I've been involved in making that clause in the law. what we also have been doing is insisting on the governance of research. It means that research should be, everything which we do should be transparent in a general way. So all these initiatives to which I refer have a good website, for example, that we are accountable, that people know, we make annual reports, people can know what we are doing and also can ask questions about what we are doing, and then we should answer that in a proper way. We liaise with patient organizations. Every use of those registries or of those biobanks will be vetted by a research ethics committee. So that we can always, so to say, investigate whether the specific sub-research, because it has a broad ambition, but whether every specific sub-research complies with ethical norms. And then data safety is sort of a condition sine qua non. All these registries, all this data processing which is involved in this process complies with ISO 27001. Not for a long time, actually, I must confess. There were safety norms, but since a few years all are accredited by the accreditation organizations for this norm. And 75.1, that is a special norm, which is a translation for of ISO into the Netherlands healthcare system. Okay, now the GDPR, you may know, I think that we are here with a very specialized group, so you will know probably that GDPR has very special clauses on research. I made an inventory of these clauses. It's on our website. Excuse me. And so one of those clauses is, for example, that further use of data for research is, well, I would say per se not incompatible. That is 5.1b. But you can also say you should also see that in the light of 6.4, which has general clauses about incompatibility. But for example, our position is as research and I seem to get the flu as well, perhaps. I don't know. But as research and patient care are very much intertwined these days, that data which you get from the patient care, if you use them for research, that is by definition not incompatible. That would be very helpful. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Now, and that is one special research clause. Then we have, of course, the exception for research in 9.1i. That is then the disease and quality registries, actually, high norms for the quality and safety of the healthcare system. And then we have a clause about special for research. It is not unconditional. It must be translated into national law within the confines of the GDPR. But anyhow, it is there. And in certain national legislation it was there already, like I mentioned the Dutch legislation. And there is much more. Now, that didn't came by itself, by the way. These research exemptions were highly debated. There was a position of the European Parliament where very little of research was left. And then Francesco already referred to it. There was a huge initiative, more or less organized by the Wellcome Trust, or at least under the umbrella of the Wellcome Trust, which had then the sort of nom de gueuse, data saves lives, and we did that together with patient organizations. Francesco said so already. And why is that, and why do I refer to these disease registries and this exception in the national law? Informed consent, which was more or less, and it is still more or less, the most important legal ground, but it is only one of the legal grounds to process sensitive data, is not always apt. For example, for these disease registries, it might give a huge bias. We want to have them comprehensive and have to have also the rare diseases, patients who die quickly after their diagnosis. If we do that with informed consent, we won't have any registries left. There is already sufficient evidence for that. Now, the other thing is that if we have then a sort of nuanced consent system, there's also evidence, outside research by the way, that there will happen something like consent fatigue. And other important thing, that is the fair use of data. Fair means that is the new norm that data should be shared, research data at least. Fair means findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable of research data. And why? Well, there are several reasons, and I won't delve deep into that because we wanted to have some time for the discussion. But, for example, for the validity of the research, research must always be sort of validated by others, by their peers. If we can't do that, then we never know whether the results were really true. Other reason for data sharing of research is that you don't want to harass people with research which has been done already. So, several reasons. This is so. And with fair use of data, you never know where the research data will actually end. And that, so that is informed consent can't cover that. And then we have also sort of other approaches to healthcare ethics. Not only autonomy, but also, for example, principles as solidarity, a principle of contributing to the public good, the common good. Here in the public interest is mentioned, I think, 32 times, by the way, in the GDPR. And that public interest is an important aspect, I think, of our European, at least, social systems. We all have also, in Europe, is more or less a solidarity-based healthcare system, with equal access of most patients to decent care. Anyhow, so unless, if covered in a good governance system, then our position is that other mechanisms than informed consent will also be sufficient for research data. But now how? The Working Party 29, which issued statements of draft guidelines on transparency and informed consent, seemed to wanting to go back a little to that EP version. And well, that's not very surprising as they were in favor of that EP version, but I think that you should listen to the legislator. And we recently, very recently, last Tuesday, we submitted our comments to those draft guidelines, and we'll see what comes from it. But the GDPR, and then I come to that, so to say, that code of conduct which we are making, has very many open clauses. And it's difficult to read for researchers, but by the way, for lawyers as well. And what we are doing in that GDPR, code of conduct is to fill in the gaps, to translate that into legal certainty. But also, I must say, to push responsible research as we see it, as the broad group, the consensus which we will reach together with patient organizations to push responsible research forward. And so there is the Code of Conduct initiative. It doesn't come easy, by the way. And even when we didn't enter the discussions with the European Data Protection Board, by that time when we are ready, the Article 29 Working Party will be that board yet. So as to give sort of to unveil a little bit of what we have been doing, one whole afternoon we discussed whether the principal investigator could also be a controller in the sense of the GDPR. Now, you see it is a non-question, but here you see how also various European cultures clash and backgrounds of research. For example, in a clinical trial, a sponsor, which is usually a pharmaceutical company, it can also be the EORTC, which comes later, will always be also the controller of the data. But, for example, if you have a common research project, it becomes already much more difficult. And then you have also systems where, so to say, which are more hierarchical, where the researcher is embedded in the university and should listen to the university and has very little freeway, then it's also sort of logical that the university, the academia, is the controller. But we have also some people which have much more academic freedom to do their research. And they say it would be hampering my academic freedom if my university would be the controller. I want to be the controller. Perhaps jointly, that can happen under the GDPR, with the university, but not the university, because then I've made the proposal, I'm responsible for the research participants, etc., etc., etc. So it is very interesting. And so we are coming now to a nuanced system, but if we wouldn't have that broad group, we would say the university is the controller, then we would miss out a lot of the European nuances. But it takes a whole afternoon to get to that point where we have now made that list of criteria when the principal investigator can be the controller. Now, so just as an example. And also, for example, there are, the GDPR is rather straightforward. That is not a clause which we have to fill in about informed consent. It cannot be coerced. It should be clear, affirmative action, etc., etc. But there is also recital 33, which talks about broad consent, which leaves the option open for broad consent. So first of all, we must get a consensus in the group when broad consent is indeed a feasible option. And we can also differ from that within the group. And informed consent is a feasible option, but there must also be a possibility for the participant to narrow consent down. But then I think personally, just as the other research exemptions, by the way, that broad consent can only, we didn't discuss that yet, so this is new for my partners in the group. I think that broad consent is only possible within good research governance. Like I told already, the transparency, the accountability, liaison with patients organizations, adherence to research standards, research integrity. But should we expand on that in the code of conduct? Because if you do that, well, you open another Pandora box. How far should we go with that? But I think that we should at least mention it. Research integrity and good research governance, we should mention it because that is sort of the balance for all the research exemptions. And then the open clauses, I will just discuss only one. 89.1, that is all these clauses refer to 89.1. Well, actually, that is rather easy. It is really, well, if I may say so, perhaps now my head is chopped off later, but I think that's a very stupid clause, actually. It's so superfluous because it actually only says that you should have data minimization and privacy by design, which is already in other clauses, 25, I think, yes, and 32. So this is not really what will take a lot of discussion. But the Code of Conduct can still have a role here to exemplify that with certain examples, how we do that usually in the research chain, because there's always a chain of data in research. But then we have a really open clause, which is 17.3d, which is an exemption to the right of erasure in the context of research, insofar as that right to erasure is likely to render impossible or seriously impair the objectives of the processing, which is then in this case research. And when should that be the case? For example, we didn't discuss that yet, but we'll come to it certainly. The Code of Conduct here should give guidance, and then that is really an added value of the Code of Conduct, that we give guidance on that. Well, obviously, when somebody calls in that right to erasure, it should apply to any further processing of data for new research projects. Logical, But I already mentioned validity of research, that we must always be able to vet others, peers, whether it was correct, well, the results of the research. It shouldn't apply backwards. We might try to, because the GDPR is only personal data, we might anonymize these data more, for example. If it is an active participant, then the name and address will be probably be erased. But the data as itself, on which publications have been from which publications have followed and on which healthcare decisions are being made, must always be vetted, even if someone, and that's why we have that clause, for example. But then some people might say, yes, but if 2 patients do that, well then your research results will still be valid, because you had 10,000, so these 2 patients, well, what the heck? But then where do you stop? 10 patients, 15 patients, 50 patients? So perhaps we should say clearly never. Well, one of the discussion points. And I will stop soon, actually now. We still have a long way to go. The process of how we are doing that will be explained later. And one of the other points is that that this code of conduct cannot be a handbook on the GDPR. There is no research exemption for the data privacy impact assessment. And so we're not going to expand on that. We're going to say that if you do research, you should always have that DPRA. But we're not going to discuss how you do a DPRA, because then we could continue with everything. And so that's not possible. At least this is my opinion, that's the opinion of the group. But who knows that the European Data Protection Board will say, yeah, but we want you also to have something about the DPRA, more than is out there already in the field. And then we must also navigate around the national research exceptions. We are not going to say, if a country has a lenient regime, like the epidemiological Valhallas in Scandinavia, oh no, it shouldn't happen, it must be stricter. Okay, if that happens, then I'm out of the group. Though I'm not coming from there, but still we must give some guidance how to implement those exemptions, national exemptions, in the context of the code of conduct. But we must, really we must, because it's a very important job to push responsible research in Europe forward. That's my conclusion. Okay.
Thank you very much, Evert. This was really interesting. We move on next to the next presentation. Okay, good. We move on to the next presentation. Annelies, Anastassia Negrouk, please join us. Anastassia is the head of international and regulatory group unit at the EORTC, which is, in my opinion, the global leader in oncology clinical trials. Annelies, Anastassia has been working for 17 years at the EORTC. She has a background in biology. She knows the inside out of how to run a clinical trial, and has developed in the years outstanding knowledge and understanding of both the clinical trial regulations, GDPR, and all the regulatory hurdles to get a clinical trial organized at the international level. So as soon as the presentation is ready, we move on. In the meantime, for those of you who I trust you're signing down your questions, at the final, let's say at the end of the panel, please approach us. We have a mic here. The session here is being recorded. It will be available on YouTube. So to make sure that we get your questions also on record, I will kindly ask you to approach us and use the microphone there.
Hello, everybody. Yeah. What Francesca forgot to mention, that I'm also a DPO for my organization, which brings me even closer to the GDPR. So I would like just to say a few words, really not much, about the health research from the academic perspective with a few examples and how the code of conduct could help. So I would mix actually my own opinion, how my organization what my organization would expect from the code of conduct, but I'll also go through what being within the code of conduct group we kind of already decided to touch to, complementing basically what Evert told. So I would like to start with just one example, just to kind of show what most of you probably know, but where the pertinence of using data comes. So this is kind of complex figure, but I'll try to show it. I don't know. I forgot my pointers.
Well, maybe you can use them.
Yeah. Okay. So this is starting from a clinical trial. So of course it's starting from the consent, a clinical trial on glioblastoma, where a radiotherapy treatment, which many years ago was the standard for this type of tumor, was compared to radiotherapy with temozolomide, which is a drug. And this is what you see. So you see some improvement, but it's like not radical. So based on this, the conclusion was that there is not so much value in temozolomide, basically. Few years later, so for those who know, the clinical trials in oncology can easily last for 10 years because you will have a few years of recruitment. Then to get those results, you need to have an appropriate follow-up, usually 5 years, and then you actually do your analysis. So between the moment when you consent your first patients and between the time you get those results, 10 years can easily lapse for a phase 3 trial. So then a few years after that, a publication came up saying that the methylation status of DNA may have something to do with the response to temozolomide. And so people went back to the tissue and data collected here, and so with the consent from over 10 years ago, and looked on the methylation status of the DNA, and then indeed for the methylated, the temozolomide was doing actually more. And so since then, that became the standard of treatment. So if we couldn't do such a research, and of course in the initial consent we were speaking about future research, but we were not speaking about DNA methylation. I would guess we were not speaking about DNA at all, because with a 10-year time, who could know which new techniques can come up? So if we are not able, with a kind of decent level of formalities, to perform this research, being able to go back to data and tissue collections that we collected, even on the basis of consent, many, many years ago, but of course not describing in details what we are doing later, then this type of research will become impossible, and actually this will cost in death of people. Because you could also say, okay, but then you can do this research prospectively. Yeah, but it's 10 years more. It's 10 years of people without treatment, but it's also, we are also in the economic environment of pharmaceutical companies, so they'll not wait 10 years before they can actually decide that the drug is not worth it and just abandon the development. So these kind of trials and these possibilities are absolutely essential. And of course, without saying, within these 10 years, some of patients are unfortunately not there anymore. And those who are fortunately still alive, well, I'm not sure in glioblastoma, but in some other types of cancer, they're not on follow-up anymore. They're back to their normal lives. They're back to their general physicians. We cannot find them anymore. And we probably shouldn't. They're back to their normal lives. They told, take my data and do research with it. And actually here we are not asking like for research whatsoever. We're asking for cancer research, which is already, for me, a very decently defined scope. So the devil is in the detail. So when you read through the legislation, and we were all worried about where windows can be opened for the research, but fortunately we find some windows, but actually it can go much further. For instance, now Working Party 29 documents are coming up for consultation, and then they are being finalized. I think in all the documents which came up to now, to start with, in the initial draft, I couldn't find any example pertinent to research. Then, of course, we commented, and I think once they changed their mind and they put it something more or less relevant to research. I find it very troublesome because maybe research is not, doesn't represent the most of people that would actually work with this regulation. But I think research in terms of stakes and concerns is very different from online shop. I mean, we are not working with just clients. It's much more complex. All their examples, it's like Chinese. It's very difficult to understand what does it mean for research. And I think it would be very important that we do have some examples pertinent to research. So for me, this is what Code of Conduct can do, is through rules that come up from the legislation and from the guidances, but just kind of produce illustrative examples that explain to people better what does it mean in the context of the research. So for the DPIA, I, for now, kind of diverge from the Code of Conduct group. So as I told, I'm a DPO for my organization. So I am in the process of implementation of this. And yes, there are methodologies. I mean, there is CNIL methodology, then you take it, and then what? And then on top, the DPIA is not supposed to be done by DPO. It's supposed to be done by actually people working with data. DPO is there to advise. And I have no idea how I can explain to my colleagues what they're supposed to do and how they do it. It's just, I mean, yes, methodology, you need to assess the risk, you need to see which threats are over there, but how you do it? You just go with your imagination, and without any kind of systematic approach, you are trying just to imagine whatever can happen. And it's particularly troublesome that we actually have a very little record of breaches. So you don't really have a library where you can actually look on what can happen. It's very few examples. So it's like how far you can go and how granular you can go in trying to imagine all wrongs that can happen. So if you ask to my colleagues, they'll say the risk is 0 because nothing ever happened. So I think we may still give some guidance on like how granular you may go. So records on processing activities in the scope of research. How granular shall it be? What about the harmonization of the models? I'm particularly worried about this because I'm working in international research, and my organization is based in Belgium. So, of course, the key data protection authorities, Belgian data protection authorities, and they issued a model of record, how you can keep a record. It's an Excel sheet. What I can see, of course, I'm looking on other data protection authorities, CNIL being a very important one. Well, if you look on the model they produced, they're speaking about different things. It's a different level of granularity. So, of course, I need to comply with Belgian requirements, but I'll be working with a lot of other partners who will come from other countries. In some cases, those will be processors. In some cases, I will be the processor. In some cases, we will be joint controllers. So, I mean, how we will work if our records are not harmonized? I mean, if we would like to question those, our capacity to answer certain questions with certain granularity will be very different. And also in terms of the time it takes, it's very different how deep you go. So for me, there's a need for at least a kind of harmonization or at least an understanding. For me, the main goal that this code of conduct can achieve is some level of harmonization specifically for international research. So, for instance, what do we do if data protection authorities do not align on exemptions for research? What if some say, well, right to be forgotten or right to erasure, those are the limits. And the others say, no, those are the limits. And another authority say, well, no, you cannot refuse this right to the patient. And what we do with the international databases? I mean, it becomes impossible. So it's very important. So I don't know how far. We had a huge debate about how far this code of conduct can go on stepping up into the competence of member states, speaking about safeguards and also speaking about exemptions. So we still don't have a full consensus on this. But I think the Code of Conduct needs to provide some kind of harmonization, even if, of course, we cannot supersede the member state law. The methodology for pseudonymization. We already know that different countries using the same word, pseudonymization, put a different meaning in it, in terms of who holds the key, in terms of double pseudonymization, etc., etc. So again, how you do if you work in an international environment. If you are doing an upfront collection, probably you will put your bar at the highest level, which is actually very time and money consuming. But if you are afterwards combining data sets from different sources, that might add even additional complication. The types of safeguards, including for the future use, if all those safeguards are different, again, in case of international research, it will be a complete mess. Definition of the purpose. Well, very little people kind of pay attention to this. We all speak about the research purpose, but actually we don't realize that we are speaking about different things. Some people speak about the type of research. So your purpose would be, in my case, my purpose would be to do the clinical research in oncology. It's a purpose. And actually that's how Belgian data protection authorities look on it. And within this purpose, which is always the same, I'll have different research projects. But some other countries, some other organizations look on it as like project by project by project. So if you try to compare it to a bookshop online, your purpose is actually to, to register what your clients want and to sell the things and eventually send it to them. That's your purpose. Your purpose is not to execute each order of each client, right? So I don't know why researchers have this tendency to think that each project is a purpose by itself, but that's how many look on it, including ethical committees, for instance. Eventual limitation for the use of sensible data. Well, this can differ from one country to another. This is the Article 9.4. How far we can go to harmonize it among member states, that's not very clear, and definitely what to do with the legacy data. So what I call legacy data is the data we've collected until now, well, until actually 25th of May this year, and which conditions of the collection obviously do not comply with this regulation in terms of the consent, what is in the consent, how it was obtained, etc. It was legally done, but that depends on each country. And so the answer on what and how we will be able to do with this data is very different. Some have the tendency to say that the legacy stay legacy. Some others say that you still need to apply the regulation. And so it would be interesting to have something written that would clarify this question, which is important. So it's just examples. There are more devils in the detail. Actually, I think this is the biggest question. Aren't we overshooting? And if you ask my personal opinion, we are overshooting from far. And even worse than what we did with the clinical trial directive, where all trials decreased with at least 25%. GDPR is currently formulated, has costs, and it's not negligent. In one of other conferences, I've heard from one of the pharmaceutical companies who was already in a luxury position of having 14 people working in the data privacy department. They informed the audience that they had already to increase their department to 40. So I'm working in an organization which overall have like 200 people. We have hundreds and hundreds of clinical research projects. We cannot afford this amount of privacy officers. So it has cost. So for cost, we need to know that we are taking something out of it, that it's worth it. And actually, this is just a general description of breaches that you can find on the internet from the breachlevelindex.com. When you see the healthcare is already not the area where there are the most of breaches, right? And actually research is even less and less than healthcare. There are more breaches in healthcare than there are breaches in research. If you look on the number of breaches by type, the majority of breaches are about stealing identity. So we are working with pseudonymized data usually. We don't have any data on identity. So it's like taking this and taking that, our type of kind of breaches would be probably just nuisance, which is by itself like 1% of less than 2%. I mean, what we're speaking about. And what you can also read in there that they happily announced that actually 4% of all those breaches, in 4% or 5% depending on years, data were encrypted and so of no use to those who tried to steal them. Well, what they don't take into account, because this is a technique used for the research and not so much for the rest of the kind of cases, do we know if pseudonymization basically protects the data as good as encryption? I mean, when you get the pseudonymized data, what can you do with it? Unless you simultaneously break into several databases and eventually link things. I mean, you need to have a strong motive. And provided your identity is not in there and provided your bank details are not in there, what's your motive? So I think we are overshooting because I think basically risks are very low. What we need also to think about is that, of course, you have privacy. It's important privacy. But you do have in research the need for transparency, the need for data sharing, the need for public scrutiny of research, and finally, the scientific liberty, which is one of also fundamental rights of individuals. And actually, you have another kind of cornerstone, which is the commercial confidentiality and unfair competition, how it plays in there. Well, in the scope of clinical trials, there was a huge fight for transparency because kind of transparency was going against commercial confidentiality and industrial partners were not so much willing to provide the data for public scrutiny. Well, now they actually have a better argument. If they really don't want to share the data, they'll just say it's privacy, guys. So, I mean, we really need to worry about transparency and scientific freedom and the data sharing and the public scrutiny because, yeah, that shall, not that we shall minimize privacy, but we shall balance those. And I'm finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If there are no questions from the audience, no burning questions at the moment, our next speaker is Alastair Kent. Alastair is the chair of the BBMRI-ERIC Stakeholder Forum. He has been the executive director of Genetic Alliance UK for almost 25 years and moved on as in a non-executive role, which I know he terribly enjoys, as ambassador of the same institution.
Oh, thank you. This is not a technical presentation at all, because I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a data protection officer. I'm not a scientist or a clinician or a researcher. I'm a patient advocate, and I speak on behalf of those individuals, those families who are affected by the whole spectrum of life-limiting chronic conditions. And unlike a lot of people, as a patient, I want my data to be shared. I want my doctors to talk to each other so that they can compare me with other people and work out what anomalies they detect in me that might contribute to their understanding of my condition, that will help me to understand what's happened, what future choices I may have to make, what the risks, what interventions there are available. And if there's nothing that can be done to alter my condition now, then I want to be part of high quality research where my data can be used alongside other people's to help address the question about what's gone wrong and what can be done about it. How can we move my condition from incurable to treatable to curable to preventable? And the only way we can do that is by creating an environment where data can flow freely and appropriately to those people who will be in a position to do something useful with it. And ultimately, it has to be identifiable data, because otherwise it's never going to get back to me or my children in a form that can alter what's happening. So, and of course, there needs to be safeguards. There needs to be regulation. I'm not saying that patients simply don't care where their data goes. You know, you can post it up on the internet and everyone can have a look at it. But when you look at regulation, you can draft regulation in a way that is designed to stop things from happening, or you can draft regulations in a way that is designed to facilitate good things from happening. You can never, ever create an absolutely on-off situation where you only allow good things and you always prevent bad things from happening. There is always an element of uncertainty, of risk. So when drafting the Code of Conduct for the Data Protection Regulation, what we want as patients is that there will be positive guidance that will encourage the flow of data, identifiable or anonymized, depending on the context, but will encourage the flow of data to people who can use it appropriately to advance healthcare, to advance the opportunities for patients and families to enjoy an improved quality and quantity of life. And it will inhibit people from misusing that data. So what we're hoping that we will see in the Code of Conduct is clarity, is support for those people who are not experts. You know, the vast majority of people who will be using data, if they read the the General Data Protection Regulation, you know, their ears will bleed. They don't understand it. It's written by lawyers for lawyers, and great, you know, we need lawyers. I'm not knocking lawyers, but they don't speak the same language as other people. And if we don't get it right, then to some extent it doesn't matter what the law, the regulation actually says. It's what people think the regulation says. Now, let me give you an example. In the UK, we have the Human Tissue Act. Human Tissue Act says what you can do with human tissues. It also says that each institution where you handle human tissue, and it doesn't matter whether it's a hospital, a research institute, you know, a museum that may have human specimens in its collection, or whatever, you have to appoint a senior person to be the guardian of the tissue and make sure that it's not used inappropriately. Now, in the vast majority of institutions, that senior person is not a lawyer. Might be, if it's a hospital, it might be the clinical director. If it's a research institution, it might be a senior academic. It might be the curator of a museum or whatever. Now, the Act says that this person is responsible for making sure that the provisions of the Act are complied with and that human tissue is not used inappropriately. And the Act further says that if you get it wrong, you'll go to prison. So, you know, there am I. I'm an eager young researcher, and I go along to my Human Tissue Act controller, and I say, "Can I do this?" And he looks and he says, "Oh, no, I don't think so." Because he knows that if he gets it wrong, he'll go to prison. If he says, "Yeah, go ahead, go ahead. If I'm wrong, bake me a cake with a file in it so I can get out." You know? The way the regulation, the way that the law is phrased, encourages conservatism with a small c. Now, what we want as patients, as patient advocates, is a facilitatory regulatory environment, is a place where our wish to share our data is respected and facilitated in a context where there is an appropriate level of care and support and good governance. You know, consent is clearly important in the vast majority of situations, but there is also a case for, you know, public interest, where the sharing of identifiable data is done for the building of registers and the development of knowledge. Public Health England is setting up at the moment a national congenital anomaly and rare disease registration system, which will capture identifiable data about every child born in the UK, well, in England at the moment, but it's spreading out to the UK, capture identifiable genetic and phenotypic information about every child born in the UK with a rare disease or a congenital anomaly. Now, the value of that resource is going to be huge when it builds up, but it's only going to be valuable if the data that's in it, if the samples that are collected, the data that is held, can be accessed by people to make plans, to plan research, to think about service development, to estimate future needs, and so on and so forth. So if the opportunity is there to do good, then we want to see an interpretation of the data protection regulation that facilitates it. The previous speaker talked about research, but of course a lot of data is generated in a clinical context that is then useful for research. Now, at the moment, sorry, all my examples are from the UK because it may have escaped your notice, but I am a Brit, and that's where my experience is. At the moment, we have a huge program set up in a research context called the 100,000 Genomes Project, where, you know, we're taking the DNA from people and we're sequencing 100,000 human genomes. Now, that project at the moment is transitioning from a research environment into a clinical medical environment. It will become part of the National Health Service. That whole genome sequencing will be available as a clinical tool. Not just to help with the diagnosis and treatment of me, but also to provide a research infrastructure, a tool that can be used to advance knowledge into the understanding of diseases which are as yet poorly characterized and for which little or nothing can be done. Now, in the research context, you take consent, you have a formal consent form, it's a broad consent, and basically patients have been queuing up to get their DNA sequenced because they see the value of the work that is to be undertaken. But of course, in a clinical context, you know, the process of taking consent is different because, you know, you're thinking about an intervention for a patient who is in front of you as a doctor, and you want to do something to or with or for them. But we need to make sure that the consent framework that is set up actually not only allows the treatment, but also facilitates the research. Because as patients, that's what we want. You know, we want to see the research being propagated, supported, and done in a good environment. And the final point that I want to make is about legacy collections. I mean, again, these were mentioned. A colleague of mine set up an organization called Unique. Unique supports families with who have children with rare chromosomal abnormalities. The families donate their information to Unique. They might give genetic information, they'll give information about the physical problems, the mental problems their child has, the impact on their lives, their interaction with others, and so on. This collection of freely donated data has been built up over the last 20 years and now includes data on something like 25,000 individuals with each with a rare and possibly unique chromosomal abnormality from all around the world. Now, that is a hugely valuable resource. And the parents, and many of these children have died, the families have moved on, they've moved away. But the value in that data is irreplaceable. Now, it's a small organization. They physically don't have the resources to go back and reconsent under current standards data information that has been provided historically. So if that data had to be thrown away because it didn't comply with current standards, to my mind, that would be a gross betrayal of those parents of children who gave their data so it could be used. When the Human Tissue Act was enacted, to go back to that, hospitals looked in their pathology departments and, wow, what a surprise. They found they had, you know, hundreds of thousands of pathology samples in their freezers and their filing cabinets and what have you. And many hospitals, they wrote to parents of children who died, and they said, you know, we found we've got a little bit of Jimmy in our freezer. We can either dispose of it in a suitably respectful manner. We can return it to you for you to dispose of in a suitably appropriate manner, or we can keep it. And what upset many parents in that was there wasn't a fourth option, which was, or we can send it to someone who will use it. Now, in terms of the data protection regulation, what we want is a mechanism whereby you can send it to someone who will use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alastair. I'm very proud to be working with Alastair within BBMRI-ERIC in the stakeholder forum. The stakeholder forum is the group of stakeholders people that are interested in the work that BBMRI does, who are not biobankers. And I'm very happy that the code of conduct that we are writing can rely on the work of the stakeholder forum, and it's actually a great window for us to involve patients and other stakeholders into the code, because the points that Alastair made are fundamental to the success of the code and to the success of the GDPR. And sometimes we need people like Alastair and patients to actually make sure that the lawyers understand what we're talking about. Finally, we will not care too much about the time constraint, given that we started with 15 minutes delay due to other issues. And we move on to Michaela's Mayrhofer presentation. I like to say that Michaela is always the deus ex machina behind the code of conduct. It won't happen without her coordination and her support. Michaela is the Chief Policy Officer of BBMRI-ERIC, and our presentation will focus on the technicalities, so how the code will actually become a reality in the future. Michaela.
Thank you, Francesco. Well, everything started by reading the GDPR, of course, and there we have Article 40 that says there is the possibility for a code of conduct, and we as BBMRI-ERIC thought it is a good idea. What we also found out right from the beginning is that this is nothing that we could do on our own. Quite to the contrary, it would be counterproductive. Let's find out who else is interested in the wider field of research. And we started out with a couple of meetings that then became what I like to call the Code of Conduct for Health Research Initiative. Because as our previous speakers have pointed out, this is not an easy task. We have a very broad group together, and this is at the same time our advantage, because what we have to do is we have to do it right. We have to take into account the various positions that come from clinical research, clinical trials, biobanks, patient groups, and also industry partners. The aims of our Code of Conduct for Health Research is to contribute to the proper application of the regulation, taking into account the specific features of processing personal data in the area of health. Health, of course, not being an issue within the European Union. There is no competency there. However, the regulation affects a lot of dealings and wheelings and important procedures. Secondly, to clarify and specify certain rules of the GDPR for controllers who process personal data for purposes of scientific research in the area of health again. And Evert-Ben previously pointed out that the difficulty of identifying who is actually the controller, process, joint controller is not an easy task in the context of health and healthcare and health research. So we always see the intersection between these three areas. Thirdly, to help to demonstrate compliance by the controllers and processors with the regulation, this is what Alastair has pointed out, in the sense of let's give clarity in how to do it. Because the reality today is, as the GDPR comes into force, a lot of institutions really take the conservative side of things and tend to protect the institution rather than to enable to do research with the entrusted data from the patient's research participants. Lastly, this should all help to foster transparency and trust in being accountable for what we are doing, and that is ultimately what the GDPR requires from us. Be accountable for what you're doing. Now, for the Code of Conduct for Health Research Initiative, we have 3 basic levels of involvement. We have a group called the Forum that are all the organizations and individuals that are interested in this initiative. We aim to be as transparent and get them together. We have currently more than 200 people, individuals subscribed, representing roughly 100 organizations that say, yes, this is a good idea. We have reference groups depending on their expertise that we have clustered and that we aim to consult when it comes to certain topics. I just pick out genetics for the time reason. And we have a drafting group. We have 3 members here. We have representatives from research, we have lawyers, we have patient organizations, and this illustrious group should put the text together to bring then to the wider audience, to the forum, to say, are we going in the right direction or not? Is this useful or not? And ultimately then to open it for public consultation. The date for that is yet to be confirmed. What I can share today is that we have identified certain key questions in the drafting group which should guide us to put the code together. And also the interconnectedness for scientific research of the requirements of the GDPR makes it rather complex. So from the researcher's perspective, the first question is, am I handling the personal and sensitive data at all? What am I doing with the data exactly? What is then my role? What are my duties? What is my legal basis? How do I anonymize, pseudonymize data? What are the information obligations? What do I have to do to enable research participants to exercise their rights? What do I have to do in order to protect the privacy of the research participants? How long can I retain data? Can I reduce the data? And under which conditions? Who owns the data? With whom can I share my data? What about data security? How is the code implemented? How is the code modified? And how to adhere to this code? Now, we have the questions. We don't have yet the answers. The timeline so far to come to common understanding was that between February and March, we established a forum. We had several exchanges. We also have communications with national DPAs, with the EDPS and DG Justice, of course, to seek also their guidance in how to do things properly. And the key message from all of them was, well, even if you're delayed in a few things, what you have to do is you have to get it right. And our strategy was initially to start broadly, to really narrow down what are the key issues to work with. And in that sense, the state of the work found its current focus on identifying the lawfulness of processing, the responsibility of controller processor and their relationship to each other, and the appropriate safeguards. What does all this mean in practice for the actual researcher, then data controller processor handling the data that should ultimately enable research? Given the sake of time, I can only say for now, sign up to our newsletter, learn more on our webpage, follow us on Twitter, and contact us personally if you have any questions. And as we are a rather small group, we can even have the exchange in a more comfortable area, I would say. Thank you very much.
So, Yeah, as Michaela said, we don't want to keep you from getting your dose of caffeine. But if there's any question that you believe would be worth discussing in the panel, please approach us. Can you use the microphone? State your name for the record. You can pick it up.
My name is Luc van Poeken. Is it?
Yes, I think that it's working for the camera, so maybe you can shout a bit more. Sorry.
Okay. You have also the clinical trial regulations coming on. It was drafted before the GDPR. It will come into action probably 2019, what they hope now. Are there conflicts? What is your opinion on the relationship between both?
I cannot think of anyone else but Anastassia to answer this question.
Yeah, actually there is not much conflicts, and actually clinical trials are in a little bit privileged position because the broad consent option in the GDPR is reinforced by some statements of the clinical trials which are also going in this sense and which are speaking about reusing the data. And also given how clinical trials are structured, even the discussion about who is the control and who is processor is rendered a little bit easier. I think that some other types of research which doesn't have a clearly specified framework are under more danger to get it right from the data protection perspective.
Thank you very much, Anastassia. Alastair, Evert, do you want to take a...
No.
Wonderful. Is there any other question? Well, in this case, I think we can close the panel. Thanks again for staying with us and for finding us, first and foremost, and for staying with us through the whole duration. I cannot but reiterate what Michaela said. We are here for you guys to provide more information. Please approach us, either us or the speakers. We'll be glad to provide all the information needed. Have a look on Twitter. We've been disseminating the link to the website through social media, so you surely won't be missing it if you follow the official hashtag of the conference. And thanks again for your time. Michaela, do you want to...
Thank you, and please pick our brains, spread the word. We have to get it right from the start, even if it might take longer. We really have to take into account what is needed in practice, in research. I always use the Nemo argument. Every one of you knows the movie Finding Nemo. There's one beautiful dialogue between Marlin and Dory, where Marlin is kind of the overprotective father, saying, well, I don't want anything ever to happen to my little Nemo. And Dory kind of rightfully says, that's an awkward thing, because if nothing happens to her, anything, and really literally nothing will ever happen to her. And very much this is true for a lot of things in research. If we are not giving kind of also some freedom with the right proportion of accountability, nothing will happen.